Start the recording now.
Okay. Hi, folks. My name's Cole Gilbert. I'm going to lead you through some little introductory material about insects today, kind of in preparation for meeting some of you out at the Arnott Forest. I'm a professor in the entomology department at Cornell. I'm also the director of undergraduate biology at Cornell. I like a lot of other things than just insects, but in my own research, I work on them. I'm also a neurobiologist, so I'm interested in insect nervous system and how sensory systems acquire information and the insect thinks about it and then produces an adaptive behavior. So with kind of that in mind, we can get started. I know that a lot of you may first be grappling with the idea of diversity in the insects. There's like so many of them to learn, and we'll focus on that just a little bit in the presentation as we go. But I wanted to list some resources for you before we start. And there's a couple of good kinds of resources here. The internet is great. Certainly compared to when I was a kid, but there's lots of images that are out there that are not very accurate, and so I would urge you to be careful if you want to ID stuff. Kind of the two internet sites that I think are reliable. One is bugguide.net that I have here. iNaturalist is also getting really good. You can trust most of the IDs that are there. In terms of field guides, I prefer, there are a number of them out. This is a kind of an area of book selling that has proliferated a lot lately. And in terms of field guides, there are two different camps. Field guides that are based on photographic images or field guides that are based on line drawings. And kind of Roger Tory Peterson of the Peterson's Guide kind of initiated the field guides with line drawings and especially the field marks. And so here's, his field guide to the insects. That's the one that I prefer, but there are some others that are good. You can see here the Audubon Guide, that tends to be photos. The Kaufman Guide is pretty good, that's photos. Both of these kinds of field guides can work for you. But the main thing is that you have to take it into the field. And so it's going to get rasty. So there's mine. You can see, there's some pages falling out. There's a lot of dirty thumbprints from using it in the field. But that's where you need it. A pristine field guide that sits, at home in your bookshelf and you look stuff up later, that's not very useful. So whatever kind you get used to, use that. There are some others that are more specialized for different groups of insects, dragonflies, butterflies especially. There's a good one for caterpillars of Eastern North America. Dave Wagner at University of Connecticut has been studying caterpillars for decades. I'll also say that spiders, I like spiders pretty well. My wife and I study them together. She really focuses on spiders, but actually the Golden Guide to Spiders and Their Kin is really good. Not only does it work in North America, it works in Europe, works in South America. It's reasonable. So think about those. Books for home. This is the one that you want if you really want to identify insects, has the best keys, but there are also some other nice books. There's a big one by Steve Marshall. I'll show that one. It's gigantic, but if you have somebody on your gift list for a graduation or a birthday or just for yourself because you want to treat yourself, this is the book to get. It's great biology, good photos, voluminous. I mean, you saw me lifting it up. It's heavy. I don't know, probably goes 3 pounds. That's a good book for insect ID. And then finally for spiders, Rich Bradley has a really nice book, but none of these three are field books. You need to wear a truss to carry these things out in the field with you. So Let's dive in now and actually talk about some insects. And first, I want to try to have you get an idea of the diversity that we deal with for insects. If you haven't gotten into bugs before, maybe you're a good birder, or you're a herper, or you're great with plants and winter twigs and all that sort of stuff, and you kind of want to broaden out into other groups, and you're thinking about arthropods. There's way more diversity than you're used to grappling with. So if we were in person, I would do a, guess how many there are kind of thing. And I'll usually start with mammals because that's our group and that's, what we feel most comfortable with. And so there's only about 6,500 mammal species. And, a quarter of them are rodents and almost another quarter of them are bats. And so all the other stuff, carnivores, whales, all the antelopes on the plains of the Serengeti, it's not very much. There's almost as many jumping spiders, one family of spiders, as this many mammals. All right. So some other groups that maybe you're familiar with, amphibians. This is like down to the number. You can check the amphibian website, and yes, there are some that are going extinct. From the chytrid fungus is really, slaying a lot of amphibians, but a lot of new ones are being discovered as people work on them. So it's increasing, but folks keep track by the individual digit same with mammals. Occasionally a new little small primate is found, a little marmoset in the Amazon jungle, or some cattle. Occasionally a bovid is found in Southeast Asia that, people reported from Vietnam, soldiers reported seeing it, and villagers, and now they're finally, adding it to the list. Birds, a bunch of you are birders. There's the official number. There was recently an estimate, could be as many as 1,800 if you're splitting a little bit. But the total that we know is 2 million. These are not adding up to very much towards that 2 million. And there's the deal. Arthropods. We're not down to the individual arthropod. We're 10 to the 6, that's a million, between 1 and 30 million different kinds of arthropods, most of which are insects. Yes, there are, a number of crustaceans and other kinds of spiders, the arachnids, but most of this 30 million is insects. It's a very successful group, and we can fill in the rest of these so you can get a look at it. But really, this is where the action is in terms of biological diversity. There's a nice illustration from an illustrator in our department, Francis Fawcett. It's called a speciescape up here with representatives of the different groups of organisms, and the size of the creature represents their proportion of total known species. So, I filled in some numbers here, and then here it is in a pie chart, and you can see more than half of the known things are arthropods. And if we take out the other arthropods, we've got even more than half of the known species are insects. And we'll start over here from kind of the 3 o'clock range. The biggest group of insects is beetles, and that's the biggest thing up here. Very successful body plan. Almost 40,000 species have been described, and who knows how many more undescribed ones there are. And then butterflies and moths, a little less than half that many, but still pretty many. Flies, two-winged flies, the Hymenoptera, this order of bees and wasps and ants, again, 150,000. People argue with this a lot, that they say, well, for lots of the bulk of these creatures are small little parasitic wasps that lay their eggs inside the body of some other arthropod, or making some kind of a gall in plants. There's a whole family of wasps that just make galls, like a oak apple gall, if you're familiar with that. And some folks who work on them have argued that for almost every arthropod or most of the plants, there's a little wasp that does something to that, parasitizes that, and we just don't know them all yet. And so this number could be huge, even up to the size of beetles, of undescribed little tiny wasps. And then there's some other groups, the Hemiptera, so-called true bugs. We'll see them in just a minute, who they are. And then the rest of the insects are lumped into this little sector here. So think about all the living stuff, the diversity of creatures that you see and revel in out in the environment, and the majority of species, not necessarily the individuals, but the majority of species are actually insects. And it's been estimated maybe, one of every 5, let's just rough and ready call this 400,000, and there's 2 million. One of every 5 described species is a beetle. That's amazing that they have, that much, that they're that speciose. It's a really good body plan. They're into all kind of niches in every habitat. So I want to focus a little bit on like, what is an insect? I've said there's insects and then there's other arthropods. So we want to differentiate insects from the other arthropods. And here's kind of our grasshopper in lateral view. And I use this one to illustrate, it's kind of a generalized insect and has all the parts there, not very well or very differently modified compared to other insects. So, going from head to tail, the first thing we see is insects have they're arthropods. So they have an exoskeleton that's hard. It's made of chitin. Chitin is a carbohydrate polymer, very similar to cellulose that is in the cell walls of plants to give them strength. Also, there's another kind of a polymer called peptidoglycan, carbohydrate polymer that is in the cell walls of bacteria. And the way these polymers work, they're really hard to digest. So there's a very strong skeletal component, and that's on the outside of the insect. The other characteristic is that they have jointed legs. The appendages are jointed, the legs, the antennae are jointed, even the ovipositor, or some of them have sensory structures in the back that we'll see, and those are jointed as well. Okay, so that's an arthropod, but insects have a particular arrangement of body segments and numbers of limbs that differentiates them from the other arthropods that also have chitinous exoskeleton and jointed legs. So insects have 3 body parts. They have a head, they have a thorax, and they have an abdomen. The thorax is composed of 3 body segments, and each one has a walking leg attached to it. So insects have 6 legs, 3 pairs, that differentiates them from a number of other arthropods. The crustaceans have more, spiders have more, the myriapods, centipedes and millipedes have a lot more. They have legs on all the body segments, but insects have kind of skinnied it down to the minimum number. They got 6 here, so 3 of them can be off the ground at a time, swinging forward while they're walking, and the other 3 are on the ground. That's a stable tripod, and it's a really good plan. The head is more for sensory structures. The eyes are up there, the antennae are up there, the mouth parts are there with little feelers for tasting and manipulating food. And the basic plan of insects is this chewing mouth parts. They have mandibles, 1 pair, and we'll see kind of at the end of the presentation that other insects have evolved, modified the shapes of the mandibles and these other mouth parts to have different kinds of feeding structures for getting nutrition in different niches. So we've got the head is sensory and feeding. Big brain is up in the head, relatively big brain. The thorax for locomotion. It's got the legs. If the insect has wings, at most it will have 2 pair of wings on the second thoracic segment and the third thoracic segment. And only the adults have wings. The immature stages do not have wings. And there are even some adults that don't have wings, like fleas or lice. They're external parasites of mammals or birds, and they pretty much stay with their host, and they don't need any wings to fly around. So evolutionarily, they've lost them. But where the wings are present, they're going to be on the thorax, the second and third thoracic segment. The abdomen is pretty much digestion is happening in the abdomen. Fat storage in the abdomen and in the genitalia are there at the back end. And the females, when they develop their eggs in the ovaries at the back end, and the eggs start to get enlarged, or youngsters are developing in those few insects that give live birth, that's taking up the abdomen. And the abdomen's very flexible, that even though there is this hard chitin on the outside, you can see this little seam here, and I'm moving along with my pointer, between the dorsal part of the segment that is very chitinized and the ventral part of the segment that is very chitinized, but the middle part is more membranous, just like there's a little membrane in between the joints, like in the knee, if you will, here on the leg, or up around the body. So the abdomen can expand, some when they breathe, but also when they're depositing fat and getting swollen, the abdomen expands. But in some ways, it's like a suit of armor from medieval knights. It protected them, but they had to have some flexible bits at the joints so that they could still move around. But as they grew, they needed to shed their armor and make a new skin, get big, make a new skin. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But this is the basic ground plan with these chewing jaws. See what we've got down here. Looking at the head in front view, here's the compound eyes, all the little lenses that you see. Insects don't have very good vision in terms of the spatial acuity. They can't see very fine detail, but they can see some things that we can't see. For instance, they can see ultraviolet light as a separate color from blue light. We can't see that. Some of them use that color to signal. They have some butterflies have special ultraviolet reflecting scales that we can't see. They can also see polarized light in the sky and use that to navigate with, many of them. Most insects also have a separate set of tiny little eyes. Sometimes we call them simple eyes. They're more like light and dark detectors. The lens isn't even focused on the retina, and there's not very many rods and cones in there to make a very detailed image. There are hardly any pixels, like 40 pixels in the best studied ones. And so they use those for light and dark, kind of circadian rhythm, that sort of thing. And then what do we have down here? These are the other mouth parts. So the mandible is there, that's for chewing. The next one is for slicing. It's paired, the maxilla. A lot of the names of bug parts have the same names as the anatomical parts in a vertebrate, but they're not homologous, certainly. They're not even analogous. They're just, an early anatomist named the parts, and those are the names they used. But this maxilla is paired and used for slicing. And then the third mouth part, the labium, is fused, and it's like a lower lip that keeps food from falling through. As the mandibles are opening, getting ready to take another bite, this lower lip keeps the food from falling out of their mouth. And these two, maxilla and labium, have jointed appendages called palps, or the plural is palpi, and they're used for tasting, but also manipulating food, holding it into their mouth or grasping it while they move their jaws up to take a bite. So that's the general ground plan. Let's look a little bit at diversity again. Go back to that and say, all right, so we divide the body diversity up into these groups called orders that are over here on the left. When I was a kid, these three orders here, Proterocolumba and Diplura, those were considered insects as well. Anymore, they're not. I've got a break in here. They have those characteristics of chitinous exoskeleton, jointed appendages. They do have 6 legs, but we call them hexapods, non-insect hexapods. They lack some of the characteristics that we've decided true insects should have, namely little claws on the end of their feet, tarsal claws for grabbing on things. These guys lack that. The antennae. They have muscles between the segments of their antennae so they can actually bend their antenna under muscular control. Insects have a muscle at the base of the antenna, but the long part of the antenna is just a bunch of little segments. There's a tendon that runs all the way out. There's not an individual muscle in between each of those segments, the way there is between the segments of the leg, for instance. And so there's a couple of other characteristics that it's been decided that we're going to call these insects, and the ones up here are going to be non-insect hexapods. The only ones that are very common are these collembola. They're called springtails. You find them in the soil. You find them in the litter. There's some pretty purple ones that often hang around the edges of water in big mats, kind of a dusky purple. And there's maybe, look at this second to last column here, 8,000 species worldwide. So, these are things maybe you never heard of until this minute, and they're common, and there's more of them than the different kinds of mammals. Okay, so that's the level of diversity that we're dealing with here. So let's look at these insects, all the diversity down through here in body type, in these orders. So these would be orders or things that you would recognize. So if I said a beetle and a fly, you know that those are different. You somehow recognize that they're different from a grasshopper or a dragonfly. Those are all separate orders of insects. And most of the order names deal with the wings, something about Ptera. You can see here in this root, Ptera, Embryoptera, Orthoptera. The different wings allowed insects to do different things, fly different ways. And so, early anatomists lumped them up based on their wing differences. And it turns out that the genes corroborate that for the most part. So let's look at these orders. These first two, Archaeognatha and Zygentoma, these are the most basal insects, the most primitive. I hate to actually call them that because they're not primitive. They exist today. They're fine insects. But there's not very many of them, 500, 600. These are silverfish, these Zygentoma, so you might be familiar with them. They do not have wings. They never had wings. Their evolutionary ancestor did not have wings. So these are primitively flightless. And then at this point, there's mayflies, dragonflies, everybody else below that has wings. So that was clearly a pretty successful evolution. And as I said, sometimes external parasites have lost the wings and they're only present in the adults. But we're looking at diversity. So over here, 3,000 mayflies, 6,000 dragonflies and damselflies, stoneflies, 4,000, not very much. We're not going to get, adding these up is not going to get us up to that 1 million different kinds of insects, right? A lot of different body shapes. Insects were trying out evolutionarily a lot of different ways to make a living. Here's a group, Zoraptera. I've never seen a live one of those. There's 40 different kinds. They're like little termites, except they're not social. They're not that closely related to termites. They live in sawdust piles. Now we get down to a big one here, 24,000, or at least that's a big jump compared to these others. And Orthoptera, that's grasshoppers and crickets and katydids and their kin. So that's a pretty good body plan, pretty diverse, generalized, mandibles. Some of them are predators, some of them are plant eaters. We'll keep going, 3,000, that's walking sticks. Everybody recognizes a walking stick insect. There's 3,000 different kinds. We continue on down, different things, praying mantises, termites, cockroaches, till we get down to, all right, here now we're starting to get big, 110,000. And this is the Hemiptera, and these are the true bugs and other little sucking insects like aphids and leafhoppers and that sort of thing. 110,000, right? Still, that's not very much. This represents, even though there's a lot of different body types here, this only represents about 15% of the species diversity in insects. I draw this red line. Everybody below here, this represents 85%. It's only 8 or 9 orders. What are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 orders of the 20 some odd insects, but it's 85% of the diversity. And even a couple of these are rare. These strepsipterans are little parasites, only 600 of those. Scorpion flies, only 400. You know, but look at what we see here. The heavy hitters. So there's this almost 400,000 different kind of beetles. Flies, the 150,000. Butterflies and moths, 160. Bees, wasps, and ants, 150. What's different about these insects that are below the red line is their development. And we'll hit on that in the next slide. All these above, almost all these above the red line, the immatures look like the adults. So let's take the grasshoppers here in the Orthoptera. A little grasshopper looks like a big grasshopper, except for wings and genitalia. But it does the same thing as the adult. In essence, it actually competes with the adult in the niche. They're both out there, you know, in the grassland, chowing down on grass. Praying mantises, a little praying mantis looks the same as a big praying mantis, except for wings and genitalia, you know, and they will cannibalize one another. So that may have been, you know, preventing expansion into different niches. They have this kind of development where the little ones look like the big ones. Below the red line here, all these, the little ones in most cases look very different from the big ones. So from the adults. So here's the beetles. Well, a white grub in your lawn looks very different than a scarab beetle that's up above the ground. In the flies, a maggot certainly is different from a fly, or a mosquito wriggler is different from the mosquito itself. Butterflies and moths, caterpillars are different than the adult butterflies and moths. They have different biology. They're eating different things. Their locomotory abilities are different. Their sensory abilities are different. So all these, where lots of species are diverse, can expand into different niches depending upon what the immature does that is different than what the adult does. So think about these, and actually these 4 orders, you know, bees, wasps, and ants, butterflies and moths, flies, and beetles. That's most of the insects. And, you know, being able to recognize them gives you most of the insects. But then there's, you know, interesting body plans that do other things that you will learn. All right, so what do we have for development? I want to hit that a little bit. We've talked about, you know, the little ones look like the adults, and then below the line here, these guys will say they have complete development. I don't exactly like that terminology, but you will read it, because these up here are said to have incomplete development, but they're fine adults, so obviously they've completed their development, but we'll look at it just a little bit here. So here's different kinds of development. And, you know, everybody starts as an egg, it hatches, and over here on the left, we say these guys don't really undergo very much metamorphosis. That these are silverfish and bristletails, those ones that don't have wings and never did. So the egg hatches into a little silverfish, looks like an adult silverfish. It molts, gets, you know, sheds its skin, gets a new hardened skin, bigger, bigger, bigger. Finally, it becomes sexually mature, and they keep molting as they're sexually mature. They're the only insects that keep doing that. Many other arthropods continue to molt as adults, but insects typically do not. Here's another kind, only a few orders, where the little ones, they do look different from the big ones, but they, you know, because they live in water. So we got dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies and stoneflies. The egg hatches out. The little ones live there in the water. And then the adults come out, and in some cases, like mayflies, they're hardly alive for very long, but they take advantage of having their wings. They can fly around and disperse, mate with their genitalia. Mayflies, at least, usually don't even eat. You know, the adults don't have mouth parts because the larva, the nymph, the immature, was able to eat and store nutrition. The bulk of those that are like the hemiptera, the true bugs, the egg, the immatures, let's say a stink bug, looks like the adult, except again, wings and genitalia, and it doesn't molt any as an adult. And everybody to the left of this line, this is like 15% of the species do one of these patterns where the youngsters are pretty similar to the adults. Then we come to these holometabolists with complete metamorphosis, illustrated here by a sphinx moth egg, the immature, the caterpillar, and then there's this other stage in between the caterpillar and the adult called the pupa. And the wings are developing in there. The caterpillar has a little group of cells, stem cells, that contain the instructions for how to make those adult structures that aren't present in the immature. So stem cells for making wings, stem cells for making the compound eye, because caterpillars don't have compound eyes, maggots don't have compound eyes, and then stem cells in the back for making genitalia. And during the pupal stage, those tissues start to expand and make their structures. Some people kind of erroneously think that it turns into a soup inside there and everything is remodeling. And that's not the case at all. That yes, things are changing, but it's not a soup. So like the gut runs from the front end back to the anus. And for caterpillars that are herbivores or solid food feeders, it's a fairly thick, straight gut. The pupa still has a gut running through it, but it's going to become the gut of this fluid feeding adult. And so it doesn't need to be thick, and fluid doesn't contain so many nutrients. So the fluids need to last a longer time in the gut. They get a very sinuous, long gut, much longer than the length of their body, so that there's more chance to absorb nutrients from the food. But it doesn't turn to a soup. It still has a gut at the start, a gut in the middle, and a gut like that. All right. So what else do we have here? Just some folks ask, well, how long do they live? Most insects get this life cycle done in a year. There are a few that will live longer. The longest living ones of insects that we know about are probably the periodical cicadas that live underground for 16 years. And in the last year, then they come up as adults, but all of their time is spent in this stage, the immature stage, sucking on plant roots. There are some others, honeybees can live a little bit longer, termites. It's hard to study them because the queens are so, buried deep in the ground to see actually how long they do live. Our local insects, those maybe some of the longer lived ones, honeybees, the monarchs that are here growing now, they're haven't quite yet started to migrate to Mexico. But they'll go down there and spend the winter as an adult. They've been about a month up here as caterpillars, and now they'll spend, I don't know what it's going to be, 5 months or something like that, in Mexico, in the highlands there in the state of Michoacan. And then come February, they'll come kind of turn on their genitalia and get ready to mate, and then fly back up to the southern United States, but they won't get here. So they might have a, not quite a year life cycle. What else do we have? Yeah, I think we'll go on to the next bit. So who's related to who? In that previous slide that showed the numbers of species, it's laid out kind of like a phylogenetic tree or a family tree, but this really is the tree that shows the branching pattern, who's related to who. So mayflies and dragonflies and damselflies are most closely related to each other. And those are kind of the next of kin to all the rest of the insects. And we separate them by the way that their wings fold. That, you know, the dragonflies and the mayflies, they can't fold their wings down flat over their back. They can put them towards their back, but not flat down the way that the rest can. And that evolutionary change happened here, that all of these guys can put their wings kind of flat down over their back. Then, down here is where that holometabolous, the complete metamorphosis, developed. So here's the ones, the orders where the larva, the immature, looks different than the adult. There's the beetles, there's the flies, again, butterflies and moths, and the bees, wasps, and ants are down here. So you can kind of use this to see who actually is more closely related to who. The next set of slides, I'm not going to go over them, but I wanted you to have them. And they are a little synopsis of these particular orders, right? There's 20 some odd, kind of depends if you're a lumper or a splitter. Some people consider a couple of orders as so similar that maybe they belong in one and they're really suborders, but that's an artificial classification. But to get a grasp of these, there's some that you have some ideas about, right? The common ones, the bees, wasps, and ants maybe, or beetles or flies. But there are some other odd ones, cockroaches, what they do, how you tell them apart. So I've put all the kind of orders here so that you have a little synopsis to start to get your head around this amazing diversity that we have in insects. So yeah, some of them you might bump into, but depending on what you do, if you're a gardener, for instance, down here, back and from the bottom, the thrips, and it's a weird word. A single one is called a thrips, and more than one is like 2 or 3 thrips. So it's always has the S on it, it's plural. And these guys are kind of pests in the garden. They can be, or they can be in flowers or some vegetables, and depending on if you do that kind of work, or hobby, you've seen them, but otherwise most folks would never bump into these. Bugs, true bugs. Yes, I'm sure you've heard cicadas. You've seen bugs. There's some that come into houses in the winter. In New York, the western pine seed bug comes in. It's a thing about an inch long, kind of brown, and they produce an odor if you irritate them. And so it's often, if you get a bunch in your house that are going to try to overwinter, to get rid of them without getting the odor sprayed out and on the walls is often a challenge. And using the vacuum to vacuum them up, that can work pretty quickly. Anyway, here's the orders of different insects, kind of for your record, just to get a quick overview of some morphological characteristics and how they make a living in their life stages. How to tell them apart, again, picture guides, but you might actually thumb through a lot to find a picture of the one that looks like yours. So I've included a little picture key for winged insects, right? So it's only going to work for adults because that's the only stage that has wings. But you can work your way through 2 wings versus 2 pair of wings and kind of go down whether the wings have scales or they don't have scales, and at least come to the order of insects. If you never have really gotten into this before, this will be a kind of a beginner's way to get into, to grapple with this diversity, this ordinal diversity. So I want to finish up, I just have 2 more slides. I want to finish up with feeding. We talked about the basic feeding is mandibles. That's the basal. Most of the insects down there below the hemiptera, pretty much, have just jaws, and they chew stuff up with jaws, whether it's plant material or they're predators and they eat animals. But here are some other modifications. So bees, we'll take this, we're looking at the front of the face, compound eye, there's a simple eye, antennae, there's a front lip, and there's their mandible. So they have jaws, and bees use jaws for chewing pollen and manipulating wax so they can build the honeycomb. But the other mouth parts that are behind the maxilla and the labium are modified, instead of into slice and dice and just being a lower lip, are actually built into a little sucking tube that kind of the structures all come together. Usually they're folded up behind the head, under the head, behind the mandibles. And then when they want to suck something like nectar or actually water, bees collect water in the summertime when the hive is hot. They'll go out and collect water and bring it back and spit it out in the hive and smear it around and do evaporative cooling in their hive. But to make this sucking tube, they have these, kind of five structures here, and they flip them out and hold them together, and it makes a tube, but it's behind the jaw, so they can chew and they can lap or suck stuff up. Some insects take this even farther and have lost the mandibles entirely, or the mandibles are no longer chewing, but they're evolutionarily modified into long, thin structures. So something like a fly and the mosquito can actually pierce you with those, or they and then suck your blood up, at least the girls. The guys use it to suck nectar up, or like a horsefly doesn't actually pierce you, but they have a raspy end that just scrapes away a bunch of your skin so that the blood pools up, and they lap that up. Evolutionarily, we've identified that these structures are the mandible and the maxilla, but they just have this different shape for allowing them to exploit a different niche. Here's another one, the Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies. The most primitive moths, we don't have them in the United States, they're in New Zealand. The most primitive moths still have jaws, right? So they still do chewing, but after that, the mouth parts got modified into this long, coily proboscis with a channel for sucking up nectar. And it's part of the exoskeleton. It's coiled up. It's a little more flexible. There's some proteins in there, like at the joints in the exoskeleton, that make it flexible, at the legs or the abdomen that I talked about. These guys have that protein incorporated in there, and they have to actually use blood pressure. They increase their blood pressure to extend this. It's almost like one of those party noisemakers where you blow in it and whoop, does that kind of thing. Well, they increase their blood pressure and push this out so they can probe flowers. It doesn't make a noise like the party horn, but and then it folds back up when they're not using that pressure. But it's modified those original chewing mouth parts. The last one that I want to talk about is in the Hemiptera. So 110 species, it's a 110,000. So it's a pretty successful group, and they've modified their mouth parts into this piercing thing. And it's got a sheath that is the lower lip, and then the mandible and the maxilla form a little tube, actually two tubes that run inside this. So they'll push it up. You can see this picture over on the left here. The mandible and maxilla come together, but leave an opening. I don't know if this is quite working in the camera. They actually leave two openings from coming together. And The one in the back is a salivary canal, and they can inject salivary enzymes either into the plant that they're feeding in, like this picture down here in the lower right, or into an animal and inject salivary enzymes in. I'm studying in my research lab an assassin bug, and you can guess by the name that doesn't play nice with other creatures, and it injects its spit. It's neurotoxic, and so it can stab a cockroach, inject spit in, and the cockroach is paralyzed in less than 30 seconds. And then it also, in one lobe of the salivary gland, we've determined has the neurotoxic component, and the other lobes have salivary digestive enzymes. And we can milk the bug and get the spit ourselves and inject it ourselves, and we're kind of analyzing the chemistry of it and also how it affects the nervous system to induce that paralysis. But so they have that salivary channel for injecting, and then they have another channel for slurping out the digested inside. So they're essentially taking a liquid diet, whether it's from a plant or from an animal that they've stuck. So I think I'll stop there. This is the last slide that I have. I'll stop sharing my screen here and go back to being my full image self. So that was a really quick overview of insect diversity, kind of the morphology and how they divide up into the various groups. We couldn't obviously cover it even in a whole class. I'm teaching an insect biology class right now at Cornell for the entire semester, and we'll just barely scratch the surface on what there is for insect diversity. But I hope you can get out and look at insects, get a field guide, take some pictures. I look forward to seeing, I guess, half of you at the Arnott Forest in several weeks or so. And enjoy insects. They're everywhere. Most of them are small, so you have to get down and look for them, but they will reward you. They do a lot of cool stuff. So see you later. Thanks for your attention.